Voilà, donc nous avons... Vous m'entendez? Oui. Alors, nous avons le plaisir donc d'accueillir Marianne LESIMPLE, directrice commerciale et marketing de la Réunion des Musées Nationaux.
Okay, moving on. The retail trend regarding children in Réunion National Museums. Hello, everyone. I'm going to present some of the trends for youth in museums. If you don't know us, I just have one slide from our museum. So we're in charge of managing libraries and boutiques in France. So we have expertise on editions of license and merchandising and managing a bookstore boutiques. We're in 34 places, Louvre, Château de Versailles, and other places. So, and also in France, and we have the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. So our products are sold through the boutiques, the internet, thanks to our catalogs, and also resellers across the world. Now, regarding kids' trends in museums, what we can see there are four main trends that we can break down here. The first one being the reward buy, the reward purchase. You take your kids to visit a museum, and maybe they don't really want to go see the nth exhibition, but you promise them that once it's over, they get a gift, they get a present. So, and that will remind them about their visit in the museum. And so they can remember, it will remind them of their experience. So these are some of the products that we see in the bookstore, board games. And I think that anyone and everyone who has children, if they drag them to a museum, well, we all appreciate this first trend here. Then the second trend is what we call the impulse buy. And this is something you haven't planned to buy an nth product. We've got tons of them in your closet at home, but you give in to a toy, a figurine, an icon, and you hadn't planned to buy it, but it reminds you of somebody. It's just a little impulse buy. This little Napoleonette figurine that you hadn't planned to put in your shopping basket when you came in to see the show, but to see the exhibition, but you caved and decided to go for it. And this is the gift purchase, and this is relatively new. So during the year, if you're buying gifts, you're thinking, rather than buying an nth Barbie or Power Rangers or whatever it is that's hip right now, you want to buy something a bit more cerebral, a higher quality toy. So you go with a toy that has a completely different connotation over the products that we see for kids. And so we have this whole youth section. The last thing is the nostalgic purchase. So you relate to a character. It reminds you of something in your childhood. And so we'll be back to this range that we developed in a minute. But here you want to share something that you experienced as a child. You want to share the emotions that you experienced as a child. So there's a character that you are interested in, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So these are some of the youth products that we saw that you've seen regarding licensed products. Today, our clients increasingly want to have products that have been eco-designed and possibly a short circuit products in France. Also something that's part of a collaboration that has meaning. And some new trends that are related to the period that we just experienced, of confinement and being locked down, and participating with your family in a joint activity that brings us together, that again can reestablish a connection that you had with an exhibition or just generally with art. So these are things that we can see no matter what the licensed products are from the museums, and these are general trends, but there are subjects that are even more interesting, say, for youth, such as products that promote artistic and cultural learning, not just playing, not just experiencing emotion, but also sharing values, handing down values and knowledge through a game, products, to enable younger people to be interested in all these activities through the games. This is where all the work that we have to carry out is about making sure that when we work on a product for kids, you have the cultural notion in there, the cultural guarantee, as it were. We're working with the museum teams, curators, guides, to make sure that we don't get anything wrong here. Make sure the whole narration and explanation work allows for the handing down of this knowledge and this experience to the youth so that they can grow their knowledge in art. Now let me present some concrete cases to you. 2 stories. The Napoleon range. So in the Napoleon exhibition organized by the Grand Palais and La Villette in December 2021, we looked at the proposition that we could put together on Napoleon. So we developed these very differentiating offers with several different approaches for different clients. So the first one is very literal, based on the Napoleon character, where you'll see you have all of the codes and elements that characterize Napoleon. And then a homemade design here, using current codes with characters that are a bit more manga-like, that are cuter. And you see the Napoleonette never really was a person, but you knew that. So by talking with the curators and people working on the exhibition, they said, well, hold on. Napoleon also has this character traits. I've got some Napoleon girls in my family and friends. So that's why we came up with Napoleonetta. So taking the Napoleon codes, but applying them to a feminine version. So you can have fun with the codes as well, with the youth, and come up with products that are collabs. This we did with Macumelage, which is a French company. And again, in this desire for learning, you always want to enrich the narrative with historic themes. This is why we worked on the First Empire with these distinctive elements at that time period. So here you have a visual of what we did with Oh My, again, a French company, to enrich the narrative. And again, you have an activity that can be done with the whole family. So interesting, the idea of handing down or conveying information and experiences and doing this together. If I come back to the Playmobil, here the Napoleon Playmobil, what's really interesting here is you see there are 3, you get the impression that there are 3, but on my right you can see that first Napoleon, who actually existed, that Playmobil launched in a series of their figurines. And we said, this is interesting. We can do this. We can use this again. If you go with that game of what's wrong with this picture, you realize that the Napoleon that we have in the old one and the new one, and the one in the middle, you can see there are a lot of things that are different. For instance, the hat is a different color. In fact, you see the first one came out initially. It didn't have all the work that was carried out here. The color of the hat was different. And in fact, it's one of the mistakes. It's the rosette is a different color. So that's one of those things, what's wrong with this picture. And also the shoulder pads that were completely gold. You can see in the real portrait of Napoleon, the shoulder pads are gold, but the collar is red. So a lot of work is required here to make sure that you're as close as possible. Problem is we couldn't put his arm under his coat like it normally is, because we asked Playmobil to do that. Then, no, that was the end of what they could do. But aside from the arm, his arm position, we tried to always make that connection between the visual representation and the figurine and its historical representation and the product that we make. So these are details, but really important details, because it's this idea of being a guarantor, the bearer of the authenticity. So once this is done, we have to establish the narration in the shops, in the boutiques, and all the spaces for advertising, communication, contact, where we can we can reach the people. So this is clearly identified here with the youth, and so we have a certain number of products, but with books and so on and so forth, and we have these little characters. You also have on the internet these articles, and then you have the social network, so you can have an overall experience and be able to, in fact, all of the touch points with clients are covered. I didn't show you this, but in some of the exhibitions we work with guides and presentation and explanatory books. And so we have that little character there. And then the legends, we have this little character that enables us to say, okay, I'm speaking to children, and to give you a logic from the beginning to the end of the experience in the boutique. So that's an initial example. And then I gave you a second example where it's a little bit further here. We went further. This is Barbe Louvre, from the Barbe Louvre range here. This is work that we've been conducting with the Louvre Museum and TF1 television station here in France. They hold the license rights to Barbe Papa. So with these licensed products, you take a character, you put them on a mug, and just don't even think about why you selected that character. We worked on all of the narration and reinterpretation. And so we started wondering, okay, what if Barbe Papa and Barbe Mama came to the museum? What painting would they relate to the most? And so we did that for all of the characters, for the whole Barbe Papa and Barbe Mama family. So, and you have this painting of love and Psyche, and see how it was representing Barbie Dure. That was the family's athlete who is a bit bossy and always likes to win, so easily associated with Louis XIV, Louis XIV. And you have Barbabouille, who's the artist in the family, and he is a self-portrait of Durer. We have Barbatine, who's the bookworm, could relate to the scribe. So we made this connection here, and with very little difficulty, Barbabelle ended up being the Mona Lisa. because she's the prettiest, she's the star, so it just made sense. So now in this line, we have developed a whole range of products, 70 different products, so it's quite substantial. And the idea is to leverage the parent-child relationship because it's handing down to the second generation. You can relate to the character, you identify with them, and you want to share that with your children. And so you then talk about the narration of these characters. And so here you can see some products that were developed for this product line. And similarly, we didn't have a boutique that, of course, we created from scratch. This was a range that was produced with the Louvre. So inside the Louvre, we have the Louvre pop-up shop-in-shop, where we have the characters, the merchandising, and the history of this creation and these products. Also, we relayed the products on the website. So we had an event as well with Alice Taylor, who's one of the designers of Barba Papa. And so we had Barba Papa who was there. So we create these connections to tell stories and have this completely immersive experience, covering all of the elements of taking all of the elements as well. And so we're very successful with this range. Let me just quickly show you, showing the guys in the back there. Please show me. We even developed a format that I can't show you, this Barba Belle, where she's pampering herself. She's getting all pretty to be ready for when the Louvre Museum visitors come to admire her as she is today. So we went really far in all of the details and all the potential dimensions of this. And I took some pictures here of the clippings in the newspapers we had around Christmas that show our reach even beyond our museums, because that's what we're trying to do, is to bring that additional touch, take these products outside the museums, because not everyone goes to the Louvre all the time, though I do invite you to go as often as possible. But this way people could see our products, and it's a different discourse, so we can have these in Galerie Lafayette and concept stores, and maybe soon we'll see them in Japan and everything. So it's just a different way of accompanying, being a part of this kids' trend, and see how these stand out in kids' minds and how these products linked to the museums can get outside the museums and go reach other customers. And maybe one day they'll bring these clients into our museums and into our museum boutiques and say, where's Barba Belle?
Merci beaucoup, Marianne. Je crois qu'on a tous très envie d'aller découvrir.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I think we all want to go discover Barba Belle and all of the products of the Barba Louvre range in the stores. We're going to go back to the topic of sustainable transition of museums with the question of digital sobriety. I'm calling on stage Marguerite Courtel. Charles Marguerite. So Marguerite Courtel, who is the co-founder of Les Augures, you might have seen her earlier for those who were already present. She is supporting cultural institutions in their sustainable transition. She's going to talk about digital sobriety and how cultural institutions can develop digitally while taking care about their digital footprint. So, dear Marguerite, you have a microphone. Great. So, what is digital sobriety? What is responsible digital? And how can the institutions be present on digital and make sure that they look at their footprint?
Merci à tous d'être présents pour un sujet très important qui est le numérique pour vous, acteurs de la culture.
So thank you for being present on a topic that is very important for you, actors of culture, actors of institutions that welcome the public, who were very impacted by the health crisis that we're slowly coming out of. You were also able to experiment with a growing use of digital. We often hear about digital sobriety, green IT, so a plethora of terms that I might take time to define. So responsible digital is something that arose in 2014, 2015, before we spoke about responsible and sustainable ITC. And the word responsible digital is a word that can include not just environmental questions, but it's also going to encompass the social dimension, the accessibility, the inclusiveness. And in this big bundle that is responsible digital, we have two approaches. The first one, which is green IT, which reduces the environmental impact and the social impact of the digital. And we have another approach, which is IT for green, which is an approach that considers digital as a tool to serve sustainability. So here, this is really going to be a question for all of you who are listening. It's going to be a question of arbitration of digital, where digital has its place. And it's good to develop digital, but the idea is to not maybe get out of this presentation by saying digital is good or digital is bad, but to have elements to be able to arbitrate where you need to include digital and where you shouldn't have some. I'm going to take a few minutes, I've forgotten I had this slide, to introduce the group that I'm part of. It is called Les Augures. It was created in April of 2020. These are 4 people, and we support cultural actors in their transition, in their adaptation and innovation. We support them in their CSR approach. We also support them for eco-production. We also try to federate the cultural players around what really is at stake for culture, which are the scenographics, the production, but also everything that revolves around digital, with labs for research and action, where all of the members are going to try to experiment with solutions that we will have discussed. As I was saying, museum and digital, there's a duality. Since the healthcare crisis, we have had to face this explosion of digital. So this was the way in which during the health crisis, where all of these leisure venues closed, was a way to still reach the public. It was also a mission for all of you to make culture more widely available with a broader public. At the same time, museums and other leisure venues are faced with this urgency to reduce their environmental footprint. So the notion here is to think about the arbitration that you can make when you look at the main impacts of the cultural sector. We can see that the digital has an important place. It's part of the major impacts. We can see transport, mobility, food, energy that includes heating, and everything is between 2 and 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, because for cinema and music, the carbon impact is above the rest. This means that today there's less impact in cinema and music that comes from the production of movies and music. There is an impact of video on demand and the screening of films. So digital has an invisible impact. We've often spoken about an immateriality. There's a growing awareness that there's an impact of digital because there's cloud, the immateriality, and browsing. All of this lexicon hasn't helped us to realize the actual materiality of all of these equipment, all of these services that we're going to develop. I like to use this image of a South African photographer called Dylan March, and he came to make photographs of metal mining throughout the world. This is the mine of Palabora, which is a copper mine in South Africa. And what you can see in the middle is not a dinosaur egg, it's the pure quantity of copper that has come out of this mine. So you can see a difference in the scale. It's also a photo that is going to talk about the pollution that is triggered by our equipment, because the issue with digital and what I'd like you to keep from this presentation is that we're going to talk a little about this is where we have the equipment, and that's where the greenhouse gas comes. And copper is a metal that we'll find in all of our digital equipment. It is also a metal that we will find in batteries, in all of the elements that are going to be used for this ecologic transition, this environmental transition. And in order to get this copper, where you have to crush the rock very finely, so you can only imagine the quantity of energy that this expands. And then with all of the earth that is left, you're going to put them in sort of natural tubs, or you're just going to discard it into nature without doing a decontamination of these soils, of these rocks that don't just contain copper, but also other pollutants that are extremely dangerous for biodiversity. So to talk about the impacts of digital, I'm going to start with the environmental impact of digital. It is responsible of 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Today, there's more greenhouse gas emissions that come out of digital than from civil aviation. And what is even more worrisome is that the emissions increase by 8% per year, and this dates back to before the lockdowns. The 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions are figures that take into account the manufacturing of the equipment and the use, but not at the end of life. And we're going to talk about the electronic and electric waste that pollute a lot. So this represents 5% of the use of primary energy. 84% of the impact of this is due to the manufacturing of the equipment. So there's a real materiality to digital, and the consumption of the energy for digital is where we're going to distinguish the manufacturing of our equipment from its use. And all of these figures come out of a think tank called Green IT. According to them, 45% of the consumption of energy from digital that is being used is used for production, and 55% for its use. We're talking about an environmental impact, but also the economic and social ones. So often the various metals that you're going to find in your laptop or your smartphones come from countries that do not respect the rights of workers. There's also the question of big data that we call the new black gold. So all of the profiling of the users. There's also the question of the digital divide. I think that this is really something that is important for you, because we always talk about digital to broaden its audience, but there are 14 million people in France that do not have access to digital. It's one French person out of 6 that does not have access to digital, and there's this divide that we need to take into account. A lot of people can't access digital, and they just don't know how to use it. There's also the fact that digital is not going to change the collective experience that is also using a cultural event, the fact that it's in person and it creates togetherness. There's also a question of addiction, of the ecology of attention, and there's also health consequences about the waves. There are few studies about this, but you can't negate this. I don't have a slide on this. There's also political stakes and geopolitical stakes linked to digital. The movie Don't Look Up was talking about this with the meteorite, and Mars or the moon might be territories to explore, to go and extract minerals or commodities. We're also thinking about the depth of the sea that have cobalt or other metals there that we're going to use to manufacture our equipment. And I was thinking that these territories that have these equipments can be subject to very significant conflicts. And it is also something that we shouldn't neglect. Today, a quick point on the legislation. We have a legislation that is unfortunately not very strong as yet, not very prolific. In Europe, I have selected two conventions, two legislations. The first one was the Basel Convention, which is now 33 years old. It's a treaty to reduce the circulation of hazardous waste. It is when the rich countries started being a little bit ashamed of sending all of their waste to poor countries, and when poor countries wanted to regulate this to stop sending, where we stopped sending cargoes of waste to developing countries. I was saying that Switzerland and Ghana are currently looking to make sure that the Basel Convention, because of course it was circumvented a lot today. I don't know if you saw photos of waste of electronic waste, landfills of electronic components. There's a famous one in Ghana, and developed countries were able to circumvent this convention. And today, Switzerland and Ghana would like to change this convention so that countries that are importing and receiving the waste be consulted to know if they're accepting this arrival of waste or not. The other directive is ROHS, which is a European directive to limit the use of chemicals in our equipment, especially products like lead or mercury. And it is a directive that is regularly amended and in terms of the list of substances that is featured in it. In France, there are 3 laws that can be interesting on the subject of digital. We've got an AGEC law. We're ahead on circular economy with this law that says that we shouldn't waste. The AGEC law says that today on your electronic equipment, you should have an index of repairability, and you will soon have sustainability indices from a scale of 1 to 10. Internet provider also need to give you your data use in real time and their equivalent in greenhouse gases, because internet router probably consumes more than your refrigerator, so you could switch it off. So there's also a law on the environmental and digital, and it's going to raise awareness, and it forces you to integrate eco-conception in the training of engineers starting in September of 2022. It is a law that is also going to promote the reduction of energy from the data centers. It's also going to promote strategies for responsible digital at the level of groups of municipalities. There's also the law called Climate and Resilience, which follows the Citizens Convention for Climate. It can be interesting in terms of tendering. If you are replying to tenders in a few years, it's going to be mandatory to have at least one environmental criteria in your tenders, and in the technical specs, they will need to take into account at least one SDG.
So a few indicators if you do want to introduce a responsible digital policy. I've mentioned 3 megaoctets, which is, or megabytes, a reference document presenting for digital services to reduce their environmental impact. There is a free part and a part you have to pay for. It's a standard, and you have that on the website of the ADEME, the GR491, which proposes 57 recommendations for the responsible production of digital services. And as we're talking about responsible digital technologies and there's a question of accessibility, there is another standard which is interesting, the RGEAA, which helps you enhance the accessibility of your digital services. Let's come back now briefly to hardware. As we said, it's really the key to this. If there's one thing you should remember, it's keep your hardware as long as possible, buy as little as possible. And we do tend, as I said, to think about energy use by our equipment. We think that is where the biggest impact is, but in fact most of the impact is in the manufacturing of the hardware. And today we have about 34 billion items of hardware for 4.1 billion users, so 8 items of equipment per user, out of a total of 223 million tons of equipment, hardware. So in a mobile phone, you have 70 different substances, some 50 metals. So it shows the extent and complexity of these tools, which unfortunately we treat as disposable, when in fact it is not. We only have 30 years of resources ahead of us to actually produce this hardware. And then I was also talking about the manufacturing of this hardware. Then there is the question of electric and electronic waste, which generally gets sent off at only about 20%. When you put your telephone or computer in a recycling system, only 20% of that hardware will actually be recycled. 80% of the equipment is not tracked or traced. We don't know where it's going, and it can end up in landfills. I'm sorry, there will be some good news later. I'm giving you all the bad news for the moment. But it's important to note just how serious these problems are. Then there's also the question of programs or scheduled obsolescence. The lifespan of computers has been divided by 3 in 30 years, so more and more of our hardware in France suffers from this. So the law of the 5 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, refuse and resist, that's the rule you should apply. Really try to hang on to your phone. It's the best thing you can do today for the environment. And in an organization, what can you do? You can introduce a responsible purchasing policy with environmental criteria in your calls for tender by sending out questionnaires to your suppliers on their environmental and societal commitments, demanding minimal guarantees of 5 years, warranties of 5 years, and conducting eco-design of your equipment and services. Some good practices: choose the right hardware for your needs, because often people end up having to buy a telephone. People buy a telephone which in fact has a performance which is way more than they actually need. People don't need this if they're just going to do some email. And it can be better to buy a repaired, used computer if your use is going to be limited. So try to buy second-hand hardware that has been refurbished. You have some very good services available at the moment, so you shouldn't hesitate. Often people don't want to do this, but you really have to think about reuse. You have to be familiar with the labels. You should rent the equipment rather than buying it as well. for organizations, really try to pool hardware with other local companies, and then you can use environmental clauses. You can repair and maintain your hardware as much as possible. Try to revise it to keep it as long as possible, and to take part in collection. We all know it at home. We have a box in the office with lots of electronic waste. We don't know if it still works. So take some time at home or in your company to take part in collections of electronic waste, because recycling today costs a lot, because there are so many different metals in such small quantities that the recycling systems are not yet in place. But if today we all arrive en masse to hand in our hardware, the recycling systems will be able to take shape. And the idea should be that we return equipment each time we buy some equipment. So less hardware and keep it longer. A quick digression regarding email. We often talk about responsible approaches. We think we've cleaned out our mailbox and that we're being digitally responsible. But what I like is this diagram here, which shows that, in fact, that represents 0.2% of the carbon footprint of digital technologies for the storage of email. So email really isn't the problem, but the problem is video. Video represents 80% of the bandwidth of the web, and today online video generates 1% of world emissions, more than a country like Spain. And why are we involved here? Because 60 to 80% of the data is the share of culture in digital uses. So with Netflix, video on demand, we also, it's 80% if you consider pornography as being part of culture, and then PlayStation and video games, music streaming. These are all part of the problem. And one important challenge is the rebound effect, which is something we have all seen in economics classes at high school. In culture, this is that with the development of digital cultural offerings, we end up with many different broadcasting systems, and this increases the emissions of the sector. Another effect of culture is going to be the increase in bandwidth. There's the example, for example, of the concert of Jean-Michel Jarre. I don't remember the exact figures, but there were 1,000 people present at the concert, and when he did it online, he multiplied that by 10. So, of course, we have to do the whole life cycle analysis. They probably did avoid some transport activities. But if you have people who are behind their computer and other people in the room, you can imagine, in fact, the carbon impact or footprint of the concert. A quick example of an interesting initiative by MyCanal, which decided to make its users more responsible by indicating the CO2 consumption of the video clips and encouraging people to choose their video quality. There's no point in watching high quality videos on your telephone or your computer. You should adjust the quality to the hardware that you're using. And one other list of best practice: select videos, optimize them. You have Unbreak, an excellent software program that enables you to optimize the quality of the video for the platform you're posting it on. Try to download rather than streaming. Try to deactivate automatic reading. And there's also that Netflix effect where we watch the whole series in one go. Try to choose the right format. And for digital services, we also talk about life cycle analysis. And we have to do this when we're developing a digital service. So it really takes the time to analyze your requirements. Do we need to do this digitally? Because since COVID, we've tended to switch over to all digital. And even if we have gone back to some person activities, so take the time at the beginning to analyze your need, then think about the design, use and production to try to really adopt this life cycle approach. And I'm going to finish with this quotation from Gutierrez: eco-designing a digital service requires greater precision because you need to respond to 80% of users with 20% of resources, but these constraints are extremely fertile. And the idea is not to stop digital, but to use it more responsibly and to think carefully about your needs. Thank you very much for your attention. Obviously, I went very quickly. I said 15 minutes. I could have talked about that all day, but I hope it made you want to look into this in more detail.
On a 1 minute.
We have 1 minute for one question if you really want to. Is there a question? The lady over here. Question in French or in English? In French.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Very quickly, have you been around the stands here at the trade show and have you discussed with people from technology about their digital footprint and what do you think? Unfortunately, I haven't had time. I know that, for example, there is virtual reality, which is booming at the moment, and museums and organizations are being encouraged to develop their virtual reality. Even in the National Stimulus Recovery Plan, they're encouraging this. I know with the elections coming up, but in Macron's program, he encourages the development of virtual reality. And in fact, virtual reality, there are things that can be interesting. And I think what's dangerous is to get into an approach of black and white. Virtual reality can be just as interesting in some cases for people who are disabled or stuck in bed, to enable them to share some experiences which they would miss out on otherwise. Sometimes it can also avoid the need to buy a plane ticket to go and visit somewhere that you can visit virtually. The only danger, once again, is this question of the hardware. So virtual reality, okay, but why not pool the hardware and don't just do virtual reality? Go and visit an exhibition or visit a cultural venue. That's also a collective experience, and that is something that we shouldn't forget. With COVID, we have all entered this digital world, which I think has created a lot of digital fatigue. We're tired of screens, of video conferences. But I don't want to be anti-virtual reality, but I don't think we should encourage the development of virtual reality at all costs in cultural organizations. Thank you, dear Marguerite. We're going to have to close on that point. If you have any other questions, you'll be able to ask afterwards. We have to close the room now. And thank you infinitely to Marguerite and to our audience. And we will be continuing tomorrow morning with this subject of digital technologies again, which is the subject. I think we have a little bit of interference. The subject of the metaverse.